Wow. Well, that's that great jazz music that we associate with the 1920s. Hi, everybody. This is Mr. O'Hagan, and we're in the second floor Situation Room, taking a page out of the Zagari playbook and doing a little review on the 1920s. So let's get started. I want to share my screen with you and give you some images to go along with the conversation that we're going to have. When we look at the 1920s, I think what we're doing more than anything else is recognizing that this is a time of immense change, but also a time where we are trying to present a very different view to the whole world. And what I mean by that is that prior to the 1920s, prior to the end of World War I, America was still very much kind of finding its way. And we become this juggernaut after the First World War. And rather than continue to go outward, we try to look inward. Sorry about that. My screen just kind of froze on me. And this is what happens in the 1920s. It's an attempt to continue this growth, but somehow retain what we had before the war. And it's conflict. That's what the 20s really becomes. So we're going to look at the politics, the economics, life, and culture in the 1920s. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the decade, obviously we start with a victory in World War I. We clearly are a real reason for that victory for the Allies. And instead of jumping in with both feet, as Wilson wanted us to do, the popular perception is that we need to get out of that conflict. We need to get back to America being America. And that's what the return to normalcy was. When the Republican Party wins the White House in 1920 with Warren G. Harding, they do so on this campaign of returning to normalcy. And really what it was representative of was not the normalcy of the Republicans, but rather the normalcy of the politicians prior to the progressive era. So they weren't just calling about going back before we got involved in the war, but they were really looking to push back to the more traditional America, to the America of the 1890s. And that meant a lot of different things to different people, as we'll see in a moment. Interestingly enough, in 1920, the Democratic candidate, a guy by the name of Cox, was actually running with his vice presidential candidate, a guy by the name of Franklin Roosevelt. Go figure. They lost, and lost badly to the Republicans, but Franklin Roosevelt, of course, is going to come back to us in not too short a time. When Harding says he wants to return to normalcy, he's really looking to that pre-turn of the century America. Low taxes, high tariffs, restrictions on immigration. This looks more like the 1890s. That's what he wants to bring back. And in a way, he's kind of taking a shot not just at America's involvement in World War I and Wilson and his international idealism, but he's also trying to suggest to people, and he didn't have to push that hard, that maybe the government had gotten too involved in people's lives during that progressive era. Well, unfortunately for Harding, his ideas are just fine. And the American people seem to embrace this idea of less government. But Harding doesn't do a great job appointing people in his administration, and it unfortunately becomes known as one of the more corrupt in American history. Harding himself probably is clean. He certainly isn't somebody who's, a mastermind of all of these scandals. But the one that really jumps out during his administration is the Teapot Dome scandal. Protected land in Wyoming is actually more or less sold off to the oil companies so that they can drill on protected land. I mean, it'd be like cutting down trees in the sequoia forest today, right? So Albert Fall, the Secretary of Interior under Harding, he actually gets nabbed for it, and he's convicted. He's the first cabinet member ever to be convicted, sentenced to jail, and it's just an embarrassment for Harding. And, for a guy who was kind of a glad hander, somebody who was, always happy to slap you on the back, he was kind of the face of the 20s. These kinds of things obviously are very unsettling. And one famous story has it that Harding is talking to one of his advisors, and his advisor says to him, "Mr. President, I'm sorry, the Democrats right now are, really giving you tough time." And Harding just slams his hands on the desk. He says, "It's not my enemies that are giving me heartache. It's my friends who keep me walking the floors at night." So he made bad judgments. Not everybody in his cabinet was a crook, but there were certainly enough situations that it didn't leave Harding with a great deal of time of leisure. 2.5 years into his presidency, he dies of a heart attack, and Calvin Coolidge takes over. And Coolidge is a whole different character into himself. Coolidge is not the kind of, happy-go-lucky glad-hander that Harding was. His nickname was Silent Cal. He really believed that his job was to stay out of people's way and stay out of the government. The government's job was to stay out of business's way as well. And his famous quote, for a man who doesn't say much, is "The business of America is business." And he very clearly states through that statement that we're here to help business, that this is what the government's supposed to do. I know everyone always talks about laissez-faire. That's fine, but it's kind of nonsensical. Laissez-faire is a theory. It never really happens. Why? Because even in this time where the government's peeling back, look what they're doing. They're lowering taxes. They're installing higher tariffs. Those are specific actions designed to impact the economy. So you can't say they're doing nothing. If it's really theoretical, hands-off, the government doesn't do anything. They don't change their policies specifically to help business. Anyway, it leads to a tremendous growth. In between 1921 and 1929, industry's output doubles. The Republican ascendancy continues in 1928 when Herbert Hoover takes over. He defeats Al Smith, the happy warrior you see down there. He's the governor of New York, Al Smith is. And it's, another victory for the Republicans, but an ugly chapter in electoral politics. Smith was a Catholic and an Irish Catholic, and was largely lambasted as somebody who was un-American because of that. And they made all kinds of outrageous claims that if Smith was elected to the White House, he'd never make a decision without calling the Pope first. Too bad, because Hoover himself was a very qualified candidate, a brilliant man, had served as Secretary of Commerce, and was more than suited for the job. But the dirty politics, I think, is kind of unfortunate. Well, one of the other things that really defines the time and the era is urbanization. More Americans by 1920 live in cities than they do in the rural areas. That's the first time in American history that the census tells us that happens. So we finally are the urban nation that we've been talking about through that industrial period. And that's going to lead to the growth of all the internal and infrastructure improvements like subways and things like that, apartment buildings that are going to be needed for all those people. You see a lot of demographic changes during the era as well. The Great Migration is what historians call this movement of African Americans leaving the South and heading north. And their hope is to get new jobs. And it's cities like Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Trenton. These are where these black workers are moving. They're suffering under the Jim Crow laws in the South. They come to the North for jobs, but not all is peaches and roses. They're still going to have to struggle with low wages, racism from white workers and their white neighbors, and segregation in northern cities. And there's other groups that are being targeted and looked upon as dangerous as well, and that's immigrants. After World War I, many immigrants are fleeing the various war-torn areas that had basically come unglued during the war, but they're not welcome in the United States. They're seen as being dangerous because they speak different languages, they have different ideas politically, and this fear of radicals coming into the country is very strong. The anti-communism sentiment is very strong. Don't forget, the Soviet Union is now the nation that was formerly the Empire of Russia. And there's this sense that, these guys are going to come in and they're going to do the same thing here, right? In fact, it was such a dramatic concern that the Attorney General at the time, a guy by the name of Mitchell Palmer, actually led raids all throughout the country looking for communists. They were called the Palmer raids. And those raids were, looking back, they were terrible violations of constitutional principles. 6,000 immigrants that were suspected of being communists were arrested, and only a tenth of them were actually deported or expelled. And who knows, even if that tenth out of 600, how many of them were truly guilty? There was a lot of guilt by association in this case, not a shining moment in our constitutional experience. And it also led to kind of a backlash in terms of the actual legislation towards immigrants. That second one, the 1924 National Origins Act, boy, that one really put a crimp in the amount of immigrants coming into the country, and locked in the total number of immigrants per year at 150,000. And that number stayed that way, my God, all the way up until 1965. So we had a lot of limits on immigration, largely because of the fear as to what those immigrants were and what they would bring with them. Case in point, in 1927, Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants who were accused of a murder, a double murder, and a robbery of two shoe factory workers. They went to trial, and in spite of the fact that there was virtually no evidence against them, because of their past political involvement, they were accused of being anarchists, and they were found guilty and executed. And another shameful example of this very strong anti-immigrant sentiment that led to the violation of constitutional principles. Interestingly enough, during this era, because the immigration laws were so strict about people from outside the hemisphere, it actually opened the door for Mexican and Canadian immigrants to come into the United States in large numbers. And many, many places in the American Southwest, the city of Los Angeles in California, for example, they became very, very big spots for Mexican workers. The idea of the barrio, the Spanish-speaking neighborhood, really started in the 1920s as a result. And you can see that immigration just drop right off the table. Look at that, from 1920, and then dropped all the way until you get, in through the 1960s. 1965, there was a legislation passed that really undid that National Origins Act, and that's why you start to see the spike start again in 1970 or so. Part of the ugliness of this era, this pushback against new and different kinds of people, is the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The new Klan, ugly as they were in their old incarnation, the old Klan really was about tormenting and terrorizing African Americans. But this new Klan included Catholics and Jews and immigrants of other kinds. And in a weird, bizarre way, hopefully weird and bizarre to our modern ears, they became kind of this pro-American group. The graphic here says 4 million people by 1922, and I've read that by 1925, there were at least 5 million people. In fact, they had a parade down the streets of Washington, D.C. in the middle of 1925. In 1916, the movie The Birth of a Nation was put out. D.W. Griffith was he's the biggest filmmaker of his day, and he made this heroic movie about the Klan in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it was a horrific perversion of the reality of the story, but it was actually screened by Woodrow Wilson at the White House, whose commentary was something to the effect, the only tragedy is that it was also true. It was this terrible piece of white supremacist propaganda, but it really did represent this kind of animosity that was growing again in the country. And now it wasn't just against African Americans, but anybody who wasn't a quote unquote American. And that hyper nationalism, the Klan is able to really capitalize on that. You can even see on the sign, like Klansmen from Connecticut, Klansmen from Rhode Island. This was not just a regional Southern thing. You had chapters of the Klan out west. And look at that picture. My goodness. My goodness, the imperial wizard carrying the American flag with the Capitol building in the background. Just really vile and disgusting, but nonetheless, very much acceptable in the 1920s. And the Jazz Age is the term that's so often used to describe this time period, but it's really more about kind of the social changes going on in the era, right? This is the era where people are buying things, the age of consumerism. Obviously, most of those items are modern items, but their equivalents were found in the 1920s, right? People buying cars, food products that were labeled and packaged specifically to target kids. Those are the kinds of things we see happening in the 20s. And boy, nothing symbolizes the 20s and freedom and independence the way that Henry Ford's automobile did. Henry Ford oftentimes is credited as the creator of the assembly line. He's not. But he is the one who absolutely capitalizes on the idea. And as you can see by the graphics, 1913, it took 14 hours to build a new car, and it cost 2 years' salary. By 1928, He can build the same car in an hour and a half by separating out all the responsibilities, and the average worker can pay for it with 3 months' salary, which, by the way, Henry Ford made sure to pay his workers a decent wage with the express idea that that would allow them to buy his car. And boy, did that work well, because many, many of his employees were also his customers. That's a big change. Part of what we're going to see in this era is that business owners start to pay their workers a little bit better in the hopes that they can keep them away from the unions. All right, it's an interesting change of pace there. And you can see the numbers on the automobile. And boy, what they change economically, they are, as it says, they replaced the railroad as the key promoter of economic growth. Steel, glass, rubber, gasoline, paving of roads, all of those things, all of those industries have to grow because the car industry, the automobile industry is growing. And there, boy, there's another great example. Look at the way that the building of surfaced roads is going to outstrip the laying of railroad track. And look how automobiles by 1920 are going to just start to climb exponentially, and railroads just start to fall apart. All right, and the advertising of the time, everything showing that the good life had to be, lived in the Ford motto, right? Even the most modest income can now afford a car of their own. So this is really playing to the consumer. I think this is a great picture. Here we are in the early 1920s, all the cars at the beach. Boy, roll that back and make it like 1913. Maybe you see 10 cars, and all the people you see are walking off the train to get to that beach, right? Women, of course, we think of women during the 1920s and the flappers, right? This time where they're going to gain more freedom and more opportunities. Don't forget that the right to vote had been protected under the 19th Amendment. Quick note here, women had been given the right to vote in most states, almost 35 by the time the amendment was passed. What the amendment actually says is if you weren't given women the right to vote in your state, you now had to do that. And a lot of these flappers that we talk about, they're challenging the lives that their mothers had led. But most of them are young women living in urban areas. Most of them are young women who are middle class. Maybe they're working class and they go out and getting jobs for themselves, but they're earning that money, and it really changes their attitude about what their life can be. It used to be you go to school for as long as you can, 16, maybe 17. If you're lucky, maybe you're doing work on the farm or you're doing something around the house, and then you're going to be married at a relatively young age, 16, 17, 18. Now the flappers are saying, I don't have to do that. I can, go to school, I can go out and get a job, and I can get married in my early or mid-20s, right? So this is the era of the party girl. Let's not overstate this. Not every woman in the 20s becomes a flapper, right? But it's this challenge to convention. It's the challenge to the expectations of the life they were supposed to have. And here we go again. The advertisements are going to target those groups, right? Selling things that'll, make them more attractive. Palmolive soap for your skin and makeup for your eyes. And these are the kinds of things that we see today. Even cigarettes, right? That the really sharp-dressed and up-to-date women are smoking Camels, right? That's also going to be a challenge to the American family and the notion of what the family's supposed to be. One of the more controversial developments of the era is Margaret Sanger and birth control. And Sanger really, was a proponent of birth control because she thought, first, it meant that fewer children were going to be born, especially to impoverished families. But it had that effect, too, of saying to women, you don't need to give away your life to have children. Right? You can wait to have children. And that was a very controversial statement to make, all right, that you would have, excuse the expression, premarital sex, and it wasn't for the purpose of having children. We're talking about scandalous ideas in the 1920s, guys. And this is something that, really is notable. Again, we're talking about this push and pull, this clash of cultures, the old America and the new America. This is as good an example as any. All right, here's another pushback, prohibition, right? We think of this era, this 1920s, as being the age of partying, right? Dancing, people drinking champagne, except champagne was illegal. It was a violation of federal law. All right, they passed this amendment because they kind of the lag of the progressive era. We've got to get rid of alcohol. It does evil things to people. We're going to make it better for them. It doesn't work. All right, in spite of all of these reformers talking about the evils that come with alcohol, people wanted their alcohol. All right, and no matter how many posters you put up saying, you know, you want to help keep this little baby pure, people wanted their booze. And if anything, it actually led to organized crime growing because they ran all the illegal bars and they ran the illegal alcohol. Al Capone, he made his money as a bootlegger selling illegal alcohol. And ultimately, of course, the government control over liquor is going to fail because there weren't enough government agents. And there certainly was no public sentiment towards this. They just didn't want to give up their alcohol. Maybe the most important event of the decade in terms of representing this clash of cultures is the Scopes trial. 1925, John T. Scopes is arrested in Dayton, Tennessee for teaching evolution in school. It's a small case that just blows up. I mean, in the days where there's no Twitter, this was the case. This was the trial of the century. That's what they called it. And every media outlet started to cover it. In fact, it became such a big trial that the defense, which was led by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, they actually called in Clarence Darrow, the most important attorney, most well-known attorney of the era. He came in to defend Scopes. And William Jennings Bryan, who was a devout Christian, decided that he had to step up and be the prosecutor in the case. So he bumped in there, and all of a sudden it was really this, you know, battle of heavyweights between Darrow and Bryan. Probably the most important thing about it is not the outcome, because poor John Scopes, he got lost in the shuffle here. He was found guilty. He got fined $100. He never paid it because they appealed the case and it got thrown out on appeal. But this is the big difference, the big point I want to make. This kind of case led people to ask questions, to really challenge these ideas. These were the discussions and the conversations they were having over dinner tables, right? And it also led to kind of a re-emphasis, an evangelical Christian movement. Billy Sunday was the most noted preacher of the time, leading revival movements. It must have looked like a second Great Awakening. I guess you could almost call it a third Great Awakening, although that's not what historians call it. But we can see the very same ideas. As American culture and tradition seems to be under attack, we've got to go back to the things that made us American, go back to our Christian values. And that's that clash of cultures we see. Education and how we educate our students is being challenged in this era. John Dewey is the most famous educator, saying that we can't just teach kids basic skills like, you know, reading and writing and arithmetic. We've got to make them problem solvers. We've got to make them capable of performing in this new economy and in this new world. And enrollment in public schools, high schools, I should say, quadruples in the decade. All right, so many, many more people are going to have an opportunity for education. And some things that weren't going to be educating the public, but nonetheless being entertaining them, mass media. Boy, the 20s really is modern America in terms of things like consumer items and the way people want their entertainment. Remember, this is an era where people start to have things like, you know, 40-hour work weeks. This is where people start to get Saturdays off. Do you realize that the weekend is really born in the 1920s? The idea of having 2 days off. Sunday was the Lord's Day, but now Saturday was a day to play. So people went to the movies. They got radios in their house and they could be entertained on a daily basis. Newspapers increased dramatically. Magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, Time Magazine, all created in the 1920s. And you have a pretty insatiable American culture at this time, a consumer culture. People have time to be entertained. They don't have to work their fingers to the bone. These are the first talkies, the first sound movies. The Jazz Singer. Charlie Chaplin, of course, is the famous, the little tramp is always the character that he plays. But Americans are going to the movies in record numbers. And the Harlem Renaissance is part of this era as well, where Black culture is finally being represented in a very powerful and meaningful way and making its way into popular white culture as well. As we'll see momentarily when we call this the Jazz Age, that's a reflection of the influence of Black music in white America. nobody is probably more synonymous with the idea of the Harlem Renaissance than the poet Langston Hughes. A Dream Deferred is his famous poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? It's a question of what happens to these dreams, these wishes of African Americans to get better treatment, to have more opportunities. Marcus Garvey, another leader of the African movement who pushes for equality and comes to argue, in fact, that African Americans shouldn't be trying to become assimilated into white culture, that in fact their legacy, their culture is worthy of its own. He actually leads a Back to Africa movement saying we should reject this corrupt white American society and go back to Africa with the talents that we have. And his belief is that white society will kind of collapse on itself. And then, of course, part of the iconic figures of the 20s are people like Lindbergh, all right, who's so, my goodness, I can't even compare a figure we have today. He is absolutely the rock star of the day. People like Babe Ruth, or the home run hitting champion of the New York Yankees. These are people who really kind of redefine the powerful and the influential figures at the time. George Gershwin, you can do yourself a favor, Google and hit YouTube, type in George Gershwin. You'll recognize the names. You'll recognize the songs, I should say, almost immediately. They're still played on commercials. They're just part of American culture right now. And jazz, I mean, very little during this era could be more influential than this notion of the jazz age. And really what's important about it from our perspective is it's kind of the mixing of Black tradition and Black culture into white America. People like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, who's one of the great vocalists of the era, and Billie Holiday. There's actually a biography that's coming out on Billie Holiday in the next, I think in the next couple of months. So she's still an enormous figure in popular music history. And maybe the most famous song she sings of the era is called Strange Fruit. It's a targeting of the lynching that's going on in Southern society. These are civil rights leaders, but they're entertainers and they're making commentary on society, whether it's Langston Hughes or Billie Holiday. The Art Deco movement, using very broad color schemes to represent things. George O'Keeffe, of course, is one of the famous artists of that era. And writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, part of that lost generation. People who are trying to find a new way of life and representing this kind of new culture. And, you know, our big takeaway here is that we see immense growth going on in the 20s, but every time you have this immense growth, you're looking at confrontation between the old and the new as well. A lot of nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, but also this kind of consumer celebrity culture that we are today. The 20s is a very unusual time. It's a very significant era in that it really does represent a transition between one time period and another, but it's also important because it's really a making of modern America. Everything that we think we're going to reject and we're going to start over new, a lot of those questions we're still asking ourselves today. What's the place of America in the world? What do we do about immigration? Should we abandon religion and move towards science? What do we do about the issues of race? Guys, those are questions that we're asking today, and they were still being asked in the 1920s. So a lot of parallels for us and a lot of important things, a lot of important questions that we're still grappling with today. All right? Hopefully you got a lot out of that. Good luck writing your DBQ on the 1920s. If you didn't already know that was coming, you do now. And if you have any additional questions, look in the on the YouTube channel for additional links that we're going to put under this video. I'll post the PowerPoint itself so you can kind of look through the slides on your own without my voiceover. I hope it helped out, guys, and we'll see you soon. Take it easy. Be well. May the force be with you.